So guys, today we have Dr. Lisa Koche on the show. Here she is over on Instagram, Dr. Lisa Koche, spelled Lisa, of course, and then Koche, triple board certified. What are the three certifications?
So internal medicine is my main certification, and then I have anti-aging and regenerative medicine and obesity medicine.
Okay, and so she is an MD, you guys. Sometimes people put doctor in front of their names and people are like, are they really a doctor? Yeah, you're a legit doc.
I am.
They're doing your thing, trying to help people get healthy. You're really into functional medicine, which I definitely want to get into deep with you on, and mitochondrial health, which the average layperson doesn't really know what that means. So I definitely want to get into that as well. But you're also speaking out about a lot of the things and the messages we're getting regarding COVID-19. So we have a ton of stuff to talk about here today. But I like to ask, like medical doctors, what got you interested in medicine to begin with? So let's start there.
Okay, so I was gifted with leukemia at the age of 15.
Wow.
So yeah, exactly. I went in for a camp physical. I was feeling totally fine, and I was diagnosed based on a blood test. So went through high school with a fat face and a wig through chemo, and then it relapsed or kind of had hidden out in my ovary. And right before my junior year of college, I had to go through chemo again, right when all my hair had grown back. And then that time, that flipped me into heart failure because of the chemotherapy. So I was exposed to some pretty nasty stuff at a young age, all the way through asking why over and over again. And I would honestly not get answers. So I went into internal medicine, medical school and internal medicine residency, trying to find answers. And I would watch as patients would come in. They would have symptoms, and they would get testing. They would get blood work, scans. And then they'd be put on a protocol that didn't seem to answer their why either. So I would ask my teachers and, the residents and the attendings, okay, but why? And they would look at me and say, this is just how we do it.
Wow.
They didn't know, so I would drive them crazy with my questions. But I ended up at the end of all my training, having a choice between two career paths. And I could either go into one that was more of a typical primary care treatment protocol, or that was triple the price, triple the salary, or one where I kind of paved my own path. So I took that one because that was what I was on the search for. And I taught, it was a prevention of cardiovascular disease. So I went in with a group of cardiologists that were starting their own practice with the focus of trying to find out what caused heart disease. And that's what turned me on to obesity medicine at the time. I shadowed a bariatric surgeon. I helped build the entire program where we would do the pre and post-op care with a nutritionist and a psychologist. And I studied vascular medicine, trying to understand how we ended up with vascular disease. And all that time, I was also beginning and treating in a primary care type setting with that focus on prevention. So that led me into functional medicine. And it was really funny, actually, just a side note that talking about this made me remember the bariatric surgeon that I worked with. So he was doing all these gastric bypass procedures, and patients were losing, hundreds of pounds of weight. And then they would get all these metabolic problems. They would get hypothyroidism, they would get adrenal shutdown, they would get all kinds of things, which I know you've experienced, you've read about, experienced all of that. And I said, well, I'm not going to let these people sit here. Like, we got to figure out what happened. So that led me into learning about functional medicine, getting a fellowship in functional medicine. And at one point, the bariatric surgeon and I kind of decided to part ways, and it wasn't the greatest kind of end to our relationship. And he said to me, I said, well, what happened? Why'd you pull away from what we were doing? And he said, well, you went off this path of like functional medicine. You started studying hormones and you were just lost over here. And I said, no, you were causing these problems, and I had to figure out how to fix them.
Can we pause there a second? Because my problem with mainstream medicine, and I know you're in that system, 1 foot in functional medicine. Yeah. You're playing the kind of mediator between the two groups, because there does seem to be this disconnect with the mainstream of medicine. I've talked about this with a lot of people, but why don't they pay attention to things like diet and lifestyle and their effects on your hormones, and the hormones being out of whack being the core of why people are getting chronic disease, why people are getting obesity. It seems like I'm a layperson. I have no scientific background whatsoever, and I see it. And it's like, I realize you get indoctrinated. I mean, taught in medical school, certain things. That was a joke. Sorry, I was trying to be funny.
No, I got you.
And you're taught the things that you're taught very well, and you're very adept at that. But there's this missing element of the nutrition and the relationship with hormones. Like, it's shocking that the bariatric physician said, well, you kind of went off the deep end talking about lifestyle things impacting hormones. And I'm thinking, isn't that the totality of health?
It is. And honestly, I think it's just because we're not taught. And especially if you look at somebody so highly specialized, like a surgeon that specializes in bariatrics, I mean, there's no way they're going to go back to trying to understand those basic building blocks, because you can't dip your toe in. So it's really the system that's broken. It's not the doctors. It's the training and the system, in my opinion. And it was why I sought out some as broad as I could possibly get. That's why I went into internal medicine, because at least there we were kind of digging for the explanation, So I think it's a system overhaul is needed, and more people are waking up. But even if these doctors want to recommend balancing hormones and healthier eating, they don't have the education. So if you try, you can't go to a weekend course. This is, you dip your toe in and you are in the deep end.
So are you a part of the Obesity Society? What's the Bariatric Physician Society?
Yeah, it's American College Bariatric Physicians. So that I went and got board training in that. I haven't been as active in that. It's more through my A4M, so American Academy Anti-Aging Regenerative Medicine, where we learn a lot of obesity and nutrition.
The reason I ask is, shortly after I started blogging 15 years ago, I was starting to be invited to come to some of these nerdy conferences. Yeah. And it was called the American Society of Bariatric Physicians.
That's it.
What's that?
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that is the one. And they were the ones that were kind of like, okay, we're really not into any specific diet, but let's allow some of the science related to low carbohydrate diets, for example. So that was like my first foray into the scientific realm of low carb diets. How did you find the low carb lifestyle?
So for me, everything, pretty much every step of the way, was learning on my own body. So when I say gifted with leukemia, gifted with heart failure, it really has been a gift. So I learned functional medicine. I knew low carb was the best way of all the studies and things that I had read, but frankly was kind of getting tired of the, and this kind of feeds more into keto, but I was getting tired of the same old piece of, chicken and broccoli, and I knew there was more that was out there. So as I would work with patients and try to clean up their diet, I would pull out processed food. I had seen enough studies on gluten. I knew how addictive sugar was. So by definition, you would become low carb kind of if you just at least pulled those things out, which I was constantly recommending. But I would hire nutritionists. I would bring people in for my programs to try to spice up the diet, bring something more exciting. And it wasn't until my own body led me to, it was an interview between Dr. Mercola and Dom D'Agostino, and they were talking about mitochondrial function, because heart failure from chemotherapy is a direct assault on your mitochondria. So again, those are the little engines inside all of our cells, for people who don't know that. Anytime you don't feel totally vital, so it doesn't have to be something extreme like I had, but if you're just tired, if you don't feel as vital as you want to feel, if you get tired after you work out, if you struggle with weight issues, typically you do not have totally happy mitochondria. So I was trying to teach myself about that, because honestly, talk about what we don't learn in medical school. We learn about mitochondria more in 8th grade biology than we do in medical school.
Wow.
So I stumbled upon this interview, and they were talking, and all of a sudden they said, yeah, with this new diet called the ketogenic diets, this was whatever, 8 or 9 years ago, you can, if you put your body into a state of nutritional ketosis, you will trigger mitochondrial biogenesis. And I said, wait, hold up, what? So that fancy word just means you can make brand new mitochondria.
Right.
I, as a triple board certified integrative doctor, had no idea you could do that.
Wow.
Okay. So I thought I had been dealt my hand of cards, right? With the chemo had gotten rid of a fair amount of my mitochondria, and I was just trying to preserve the ones I had and make sure that they could be as healthy as possible. When I heard you could do that, I literally stopped in my tracks. And then the next sentence out of Dr. D'Agostino's mouth was, well, at my research lab at the University of South Florida, which is literally 10 minutes from my house.
Wow.
So I was like, holy moly, right? So stop, rewind. And in my typical way, just like I did with our friend Leanne, who's become one of my close friends, Leanne Vogel, I literally just picked up the phone and email and just said, oh my God, I have this great clinic in South Tampa. I just heard your interview. I'm dying to see what you're doing with mitochondrial functioning and the ketogenic diet. So it was like the universe kind of just brought in, okay, you want a new diet plan that's more exciting, that has more evidence-based science that actually you need for your body. Here it is.
And Dom is one of the leaders in the whole world with ketogenic research. He's doing on a more specialized level, trying to help like Navy SEALs and the various things with exogenous ketones. He was the first one that put on my radar screen exogenous ketones. I think it was like 2011 or 12 before they were out on the market. He's like, yeah, you can drink beta hydroxybutyrate. And I'm like, that sounds kind of weird because you can just make them endogenous. Oh, it's to boost the health. And he was like explaining it. And I'm going, all right, that kind of sounds like sci-fi a little bit. And then here we are 3 years after that. There they are on the market.
Yeah.
Ketones.
Absolutely. Yes, he's incredible. So that's what started it all in terms of really diving into the science of keto.
Well, and mitochondrial health, it's still such an abstract to the layperson. I remember when Dr. Terry Walls, who has an incredible story about got up out of the wheelchair and was able to overcome major health issues as well. The name of her talk, her TEDx talk, was Minding Your Mitochondria. And I remember kind of going, okay, explain yourself a little more. Why don't we do a Mitochondria 101, Lisa, because I think this will be helpful for people. Make it as layperson friendly as possible.
Okay, absolutely. So a couple of great kind of nuances to teach people. The first one is at a very basic level, if you just view the mitochondria as an engine and it needs fuel. So it brings in two different types of fuel. One is oxygen. So it actually needs oxygen from the air that we breathe. And then it needs electrons. And the electrons are taken from the food that we eat. So what's pretty cool is when these electrons and oxygen come in together, there's a multitude of complex steps that you do not need to worry about that will lead to the production of energy, which is called ATP. And most people have heard of that. But the more ATP that you can get, and the cleaner that the engine can run without inflammation and things coming, like spitting off of it, the more vibrant, the healthier, the less likely you are to get disease in the long run. So it turns out these little engines have been widely ignored, even in functional medicine, even in my fellowship back, it's way more prevalent now, these discussions, but it's really only been over the past 5 to 10 years that people are even talking about mitochondrial function. And it really is the cornerstone in our cells of how we produce energy. And there's a really fun, interesting thing that I'll raise that happened to me when I was studying this. So right when I was getting really into it about 4 or 5 years ago, my daughter she would always ask me to quiz her for exams, right? So she said, Mom, can you quiz me? And so the first thing I always say is, please don't be history. Please don't be history. Please don't be history. And she said, no, it's science. It's biology, and it's the mitochondria. So I was like, oh, we are on. Bring it on. So she hands me her paper and this big stack of papers. And the first 10 pages were about the leaf. So I'm like, Jordan, really? Seriously, it's a plant. And she looks at me, she goes, Mom, what is the big deal? The chloroplast, which is how the plant makes energy, and the mitochondria, they look exactly the same. So I was like, what? What are you talking about? So I take the paper and I'm looking at it, and the structure literally looks exactly the same. So that's what they were teaching her in 8th grade biology. So that, to me, I was like, now there's something to that. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to file that one away. So I probably about 6 months later, and this was not actually that as far back as I said. This might have just been a couple of years ago. I'm driving in my car and I'm absorbing any kind of podcast on mitochondrial medicine, anything sort of out of the box. And there's a guy, a neurosurgeon, I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Jack Cruz out of, So he is kind of non-PC and really a funny guy, brilliant. And he was talking about how a lot of his issues, whether it was from weight or fatigue or whatever else, were coming from issues with light and being in the OR and this fluorescent light that he was under as a neurosurgeon. And he said, people, have you ever people, you need to take a look. The chloroplast and mitochondria look exactly the same. He was like making that point, and I was driving on the interstate and like almost crashed my car because I was like, if anybody saw me driving by, I was going, oh my God, I saw that. I know what he's talking about. So that just brings up the point that these engines, which we can view as so complex, are really similar to something as basic as a plant. And you view, what does a plant need? It needs sunlight, it needs oxygen, it needs water.
And isn't that true in a lot of areas of science where we try to look for mechanisms assuming that they're unique to the human body, but it's usually in some other system out there, biological or otherwise. It's not rare is what I'm saying, but it's funny how, like, when you make that connection, you go, oh my gosh, it is similar.
Yeah. And so that, for me, I really brought in some of the research in light therapy, which is more recent over the past couple of years, everything from benefits of sunlight to different wavelengths of light. We're playing now with a device that emits 3 different types of red light, green light, and it goes in sublingually and can get into your bloodstream that way, which is very exciting.
Oh.
Yeah. So all kinds of new stuff coming out constantly. But I'll say one last point about mitochondria and chloroplast being similar, just to keep it basic with people, is hydration. It's fresh air and deep breathing for the oxygen. It's fuel, which in the plant comes in the form of sunlight. But honestly, we are now understanding that we may also be able to get electrons from sunlight. So we may be able to fuel ourselves with light, maybe someday instead of food. Who knows? It's pretty exciting.
You do know there is such a thing as breatharians out there. They literally, have you seen this? These people out there where they say, I'm consuming air and I'm going to survive on air, and people kind of like brush them off as lunatics. But maybe there's an element of truth to it.
I think it's more than air. It's got to be the sun. So if you talk about air, air and light, hey, we may be talking. I mean, I think there's so much we don't understand yet that anything is possible.
Okay, now you have my brain spinning. Is this why some people can fast better than others? Is maybe the ones that do well and can fast long are getting the air, getting the sunlight, and nourishing themselves that way when they're not actually giving themselves food?
I actually, yes, I think it's a combination of potentially that and the number and state of their mitochondria. So if it's a cleaner mitochondria with not a lot of inflammatory, toxic load isn't as severe, that they can fuel off of light and oxygen and their own fat easier than somebody who's got something inflamed going on in their body.
So is the sun now a 4th macronutrient?
Honestly, I think this is a really cool conversation because I was talking to a shaman friend of mine. Okay. So just to get into the spiritual side for 1 second. And she said, we've been feeling that we're kind of shifting our DNA a bit. Like we seem to be upgrading. That's why I believe the focus on keto and intermittent fasting and light therapy and all of this, we're shifting our bodies from a dense, carbon dense kind of physical body into one that's lighter. And she used a word I had never heard before, where she said, yeah, we're actually shifting from Homo sapien to Homo luminous. So that's pretty out there, but I thought that was fascinating. So I do believe that light, and maybe that's a book that you and I need to work on together. the fourth macronutrient. I like it.
I mean, it seems obvious with kind of the way we see
Mhm.
people who optimize their health. Everybody likes to put the focus just on food and getting your diet right and maybe movement, but hardly anybody talks very openly about getting sun exposure,
Yeah.
the circadian rhythm with your eyes, getting that exposure at various times during the day. I sleep like a baby because I mind that and I put an emphasis on it. And so you get that benefit, and then the breathing of the fresh air. There's so many things in de-stressing your body that could improve your mitochondria that people just aren't being told about.
Absolutely. And I think it's because the science is still coming out. When we talk about some of the work I've been doing in regards to COVID, I brought in a PhD, and we can get into that if you want to. But one of the things that we really dove into was the fact that there's actually a 17 years between a clinical trial going through all the steps, eventually finding its way into kind of mainstream medicine. And the truth is that even at that point, if you get science all the way through that, only about 10 to 15% of practitioners are even going to pick it up.
Right.
So I think it's just because that's not out there yet, and because we haven't completely shifted into a society where we can trust some of this anecdotal work. But you're gonna hear more and more about this as time goes by, for sure.
Oh, I'm so frustrated with the science isn't there yet, so we can't
Right.
and fill in the blank. Ketogenic, low carb. Since I've been blogging and podcasting, they have said we don't have enough science, and I'm like, okay, the science is underway, and various ones are being done, but that's not long enough, and it never seems to be enough. And then study design is horrible in most of these nutritional health models.
Right.
I have a show called Jimmy Rants right here, and I have gone over several of those kinds of studies. They
Yeah.
did one, Lisa, about the so-called plant-based burgers with 29 chemical crap storm ingredients in it versus beef, basically burger. And they found that this TMAO marker, which is a key cardiac
Inflammatory. Yep.
talking about, I had never heard of it before. I know LDL, I know HSCRP, I know triglyceride, like all these markers that would be well-known ones. All of those remain static between the two groups. But the TMAO was the only one that could show some significant change. And of course, it was funded by the Beyond Meat company. So they were trying to get a desired outcome for marketing purposes. But that's the kind of thing that's so frustrating within this realm of you're trying to educate people, but then they get influenced by the really, really bad science.
Yeah. So this could not have flowed more beautifully into this current topic of COVID-19. So for me, like I just shared with your listeners, I don't accept narrative. If I had accepted the narrative given to me through all of my different diagnoses, including as recently, I'd be dead so many times. 3 years ago, my heart gave out because of extreme stress. I went through early menopause, and I ended up having to get a pacemaker in my chest. The heart transplant doctor was in the room. I have literally healed my body to the point that I can kill it on the Peloton, and the cardiologist doesn't know what I did, right? So there are, over and over again, ways to go outside of the narrative. So when this pandemic started, I was sitting there in my kitchen, and I heard everybody talking about, you're going to die if you go to the hospital, there's no ventilators, or if you breathe on grandma, she's going to die. And I said, after I went through about 24 hours of some fear-based getting sucked into the collective, and then I was able to kind of get myself back, I said, who's talking to humanity? Like, we're all in the middle here. Most of us are not in the hospital. So I went through these questions in my head, like I do, like, okay, well, it's got to be somebody who handles viruses, but a virologist or an infectious disease, they're not going to talk to humanity. They're too subspecialized. So it's got to be an internist. Okay, that's me. Then it really needs to be somebody who understands functional medicine, because at the beginning of this, for sure, that's all we had, right? Was D, C, glutathione, other supplement therapies. And I'm like, okay, that's me. And then it needs to be, most importantly, someone who can calm people the heck down, because when we live in this fear frequency, we significantly suppress the immune system. So I started doing videos in March, Monday through Friday. I would summarize the science the best I could. I would give an actionable step, because I'm all about empowerment for people. And then I would end with an affirmation to bring people out of fear into just calm and peace. And what I was seeing, because I was so on top of the literature, and back then it was like 300 or 400, 500 people watching, it was mostly my own patients who needed some guidance and didn't want to watch the mainstream media. I was noticing all the incongruencies, you know, the doctors getting censored that were having good results, the group out of Bakersfield that like their numbers didn't agree, you know. I was, my intuition was going off like crazy that there was something else controlling what we were being fed.
Or even worse than that, Lisa, was where they would come out and say X, like Dr. Fauci very famously said, masks are useless in a pandemic like this. Why would you wear a mask? And then 2 months later, everybody should be wearing a mask. And it's just like and then hydroxychloroquine was approved by the FDA. And then in June, they put that approval. So it's like when you have conflicting messages from the same so-called experts who you're trying to rely on, people's minds, they don't know how to wrap their head around that. We need certainty. We need calm. I love that that's what you're doing in your videos. And that's what's been frustrating for so many of us is tell us what the truth is. We kind of feel like because they're not saying everything, and they sure the heck haven't said anything about how to naturally boost your immune system, just put on a mask, socially distance, stay at home, wash your hands, and pray to God you don't die.
No, it's worse than that. It's pray to God for the V word, which I won't even say. But I mean, it's like that's what they've got everybody waiting for, right? So I like to talk a lot about the fact that we have two players here. We have a virus that we don't really understand. Nobody's bringing up the fact that the two drugs that work the best so far are both anti-parasitic. They're not even antiviral. Why is nobody talking about that, right? So we have a virus we don't fully understand, but we also have a host. So for this virus to cause problems, it has to have a host, which is our vessel that we have been gifted. So we can work aggressively on this host. We can clean up our diet. We can clean up our sleep patterns. We can get the sunlight. We can work on our mitochondria. And then this virus or this pathogen, or frankly, whatever the next one is, because this came out of nowhere, it's very likely something else may come, is not going to have a chance. So that's been my approach from the beginning.
And that's my concern all along is like all those measures I just mentioned, and not one thing about eat real food, not one thing about get sunshine, move a little, de-stress, meditate, all the things that are kind of, well, duh, when you kind of think in natural health terms. And I'm hoping one of the unexpected kind of blessings of this crappy year known as 2020, Lisa, is people start to take stock in their own health, maybe for the first time in their lives, and they get extremely serious about it.
I think there's actually a lot of positive things in this year, to be honest. I've seen people who were so distracted by life that they would never process their own emotions, finally sit with their emotions, finally learn how to meditate, finally step into something that actually turns on their passion instead of just, you know, being stuck in that circle that the treadmill they never get off of. I've seen people connect, you and I connecting, like just, I mean, social media blowing up in a positive way in addition to the negative stuff. I do think that whatever the agenda was, that, and again, I don't put my energy into any of that, the conspiracy and the agenda, but I will say whatever it was, I think they very severely misjudged and misunderstood how evolved humanity really is, how connected we actually are. I believe that every human is innately intelligent. Every human is innately curious. Every human is innately intuitive. And we just need to take this opportunity to learn to tap into that more and more and more. And we continue to raise the frequency of the earth and live a life that's just so much more incredible than we even thought.
Oh, absolutely. And I joke with people, I got a 6-month head start on all you guys because I was on sabbatical from September 1 last year until March 1st this year. I come back to work and 10 days later, the whole world shuts down because of COVID-19.
Yeah, you did.
So it was like amazing to me because I had already learned and already gone through a lot of the coping skills. So when people started like, oh my gosh, what, I'm like, oh, you just chill. Like you learn to adapt, and that's the key piece. And I love that you brought that out. They underestimated what I would say is the resiliency of the human body and humans in general of being able to handle things. Now, not everybody's handling it well. There's a lot of people that have succumbed to some of the health effects. The mental health effects are the ones I'm incredibly worried about. But even physical effects that this stress has brought on their body. What does that stress do to the mitochondria?
So to the mitochondria specifically, it will literally, the mitochondria will not be able to produce as much ATP. The mitochondria may actually die off. So one other really cool point about mitochondria is that back millions of years ago, it was its own bacteria. So it's super interesting when you think about the fact that what we did as humans, we found a way to engulf this bacteria that has its own DNA. So it has its own messages. And we kind of hijacked it to become our energy source. So if you think about the fact that we have something inside of us that was able to function on its own, how sensitive it must be to stress, because it had to figure out as a bacteria in the environment how to handle stress and how to handle light, like knowing to go where it needed the light or didn't need the light. So I think that you look at the structural level, that's not only does stress impact the mitochondria, but I believe that's the number one place that it does have its impact. So you're getting less ATP production, you're getting more free radical and inflammatory reactions going on at the cellular level. And what that leads to is the symptoms everybody's had, which is brain fog and fatigue and inability to, feel good after you work out, and potentially issues with weight and so many other things that we don't attribute to mitochondrial function because we were never kind of taught that.
So would we describe stress UV? It just gobbles up all the energy?
Yeah, I think it does. You're absolutely right. I think, and then what happens, I have an analogy that I use with my patients that works really nicely, which is it's a stool. There's a stool that has 4 main legs, and one of them is mitochondrial function, is probably one of the biggest ones. But you've got adrenal function, hormonal function, and thyroid. And I tell them that this is when we look at vitality and potentially immune system, but most of the symptoms you're coming in with, if any one of these legs is not holding its weight, the other ones are getting sucked in to hold up the stool, right? So that's why you'll see a lot of times at menopause or andropause with men, as hormones naturally decline, the adrenal is supposed to take over. If the adrenal is shot, you kind of knocked out 2 legs at once. So people can really crash at that time. They'll burn through their thyroid, and then your mitochondria are just really, really suffering. So whenever we try to rebuild someone, I'm focusing on not just mitochondrial function, but making sure to support those other legs as well.
So does a disruption in the mitochondrial health, is that a contributor to things like, say, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, or is it the other way around? Does insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome lead to a reversal of mitochondrial health, or are they happening at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And the truth is it's both. I think that when you don't have proper mitochondrial function, you see things like poor digestion, poor breakdown of nutrients into individual molecules that you can absorb and use for fuel. You'll see at the cellular level the inability for the insulin receptors to work appropriately. So it does work. It goes both ways, because when you don't have optimal mitochondrial function, you can be more prone to things like insulin resistance because of impaired receptor function. But at the same time, if you have insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, that's creating a systemic inflammatory reaction. And we know inflammation has a direct impact on the mitochondria as well.
And the reason I'm asking that question, Lisa, and thank you, this is a great conversation. I'm loving talking to you today. Is it seems to me we have all the various classifications of chronic disease: type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, cancers. I could go down the line, heart disease, down the line. All of them are insulin resistance. And so if we're going to deal with chronic disease, being mindful of mitochondria, trying to heal the insulin resistance, why isn't that the focus, rather than, all right, we got an X drug for this heart disease patient, X drug for this diabetes patient, got X drug for this also? It seems to me it's a jagged system when it should be streamlined down to dealing effectively with the insulin resistance altogether.
I agree. I think where we go wrong is we're taught like a broader view in medical school, but then when you get out into clinical practice, a lot of this has not been proven, just to go back to the scientific thing. And so they really have tried to only teach proven studies in medical school. So this is being redone, but it's again a lag time, because for docs, once they're out, most of our education, unfortunately, that we get when we're out in practice is going to be funded by drug companies.
Right.
So you've got you've got pharmaceutical companies that are kind of guiding what you're looking at. And if you're running a huge busy practice, and honestly, I do get upset when people really rip on doctors, because most doctors don't go into medical school to prescribe drugs. We go in to help people. It's just that the system, and when you have 20 patients that you've got to see in 15-minute slots because of a broken system, and an insurance, the insurance is making it, you can't make the ends meet for your practice. You don't have time to go study about mitochondria. I mean, that's the reality. You do have time to listen to a 5-minute, like, how this drug could work, and then it actually works and the patient feels better. So it's like drive-by fast food. It's the same concept.
I have often wondered if I could get the same if I brought in like bacon and eggs and could come in like a pharmaceutical rep, if I could just get 5 minutes to teach about low carb keto. Like, just let me go into my doctor. I'll teach it to him. I've given him all my books and he just didn't believe anything. Again, because he didn't have the time to read. Yeah, I'm not a doctor hater. I'm a hater of the system that got us to this point.
Me too.
Yeah, and I love that you're trying to be one in the system and yet trying to change the system and get your colleagues to realize, okay, like that bariatric doctor that you worked with, he didn't see the value in functional medicine. But getting to the root cause, that's what people think mainstream medicine is about. Oh, they'll get to the root cause and they'll help heal it, and whatever drug, blah, blah, blah. And that's what people think mainstream doctors do. They don't. Most of those things are Band-Aids.
Right. Yeah, most of them are. And frankly, even a lot of the functional medicine doctors, you can see these pop-up clinics with hormonal replacement therapy. And, they're doing very high doses of all types of hormones. And frankly, yes, they can feel better, but it's not that different, in my opinion, from pharmaceuticals. We're still not going back to the core. So I like to look at, what was it that kind of put all the pressure where the legs of the stool kind of collapsed? Was it the gut that's not happy? Was it directly the diet? Was it their level of stress? Could there be a structural component? Obviously, the mindset in general, energy healing. So I peel the onion with my patients to try to take away the cause, as one step at a time, as we rebuild the body to be able to function at a higher level.
So Lisa, immune health obviously has come on the radar screen of people this year for all the obvious reasons. What are some good things people could be doing right now, regardless of where they are in their health, that could be boosting their immunity so that when COVID-19 hits them, because it will eventually hit everybody, or when this new one comes along, or new ones come along in the coming year, God forbid COVID-20 happens, tell us how we boost our immunity so we don't really have to live in fear over a virus.
Absolutely. So I would say number one is what you preach all day and every day, which is, what are you putting in your mouth? So I usually will have patients stop and think for a second, is this nourishing me or is this draining me? And how can we eat in a way that optimizes immune health? The biggest studies are in low carb, ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting. You can literally reboot your immune system, decrease inflammation. And when you think about what blocks immunity, inflammation is number one. So the more inflamed the body is, the less impact your immune system will have. And so nutritional ways to decrease inflammation, just as well as everybody. You preach them all the time. Things like sleep, 7 to 9 hours. There have been actual studies showing if you get that amount of sleep, your ability to catch a cold is dramatically reduced. So do you have your Aura?
I do.
All right, I love it. You got a good one last night.
Yes.
I've got my app, but I didn't wear my ring last night, so I can't brag today. But sleep's key. I mean, it's a big one. So I usually I'll focus on diet, I'll focus on sleep. The mindset piece, in my opinion, is probably, even at this point with the level of fear mongering, I'm watching when people get diagnosed in my practice, which is, we have a much lower number, probably because I work on all this stuff with my patients all the time, but I have 8,000 patients. So the patients who have gotten have had issues, a lot of times my immediate response is not what are they eating and are they sleeping? It's what's going on in their life. Are they watching the news? Because I feel like that right now, because there's so much severe fear.
I've not turned on the TV one time except to watch sport. Live sports is all I use the TV for.
I know, NFL last night, yay.
Yeah, I watched the highlights this morning.
So that would be the mindset piece. And then I like to describe a hamster on the wheel analogy so they don't get overwhelmed, where I tell them the hamster can actually kill it on the wheel. Like the hamster can do awesome. It can, go to work, take care of the kids, cook a healthy dinner, work out, and it can go fast. But that's only if the hamster is controlling the pace of the wheel, right? So if you have mainstream media, if you have a spouse, if you have a boss, if you have a kid that is spinning the wheel, the hamster is in a free fall. It just can't run on this wheel at all. It's floating around. So we'll sit there and have a conversation. What can you do to get back in control of the wheel? It doesn't need to be much. Can you go put your feet in the earth and ground, which helps your mitochondria, by the way? Go do that for 5 minutes in the morning. Can you turn on a guided meditation off of YouTube? It's free. There's no excuse for that. You just breathe. So I'll have people do little baby steps so they're not overwhelmed and they can take back control. And that's pretty dramatic results that I see.
And the whole, just eat real food. Like I understand stress makes you go back to familiarity when it comes to nutritional choices. I just did my Jimmy rants earlier, and it was one of my Ask Me Anything. And somebody said, I'm severely addicted to sugar again after I thought I had broken it because of the stress of the coronavirus. How can I get back on track again? And I'm like, you need to remind yourself why you started to begin with, get back to the basics. Like people, they forget, okay, yeah, that's familiar. Yes, the addiction's still there, but you overcame it because you chose better choices. So I don't understand why people make those choices to go to the junk when there's other ways to kind of make yourself feel better.
I think honestly, a lot of it is that when we are, especially again, watching mainstream media, not to harp on that, but we get into what's called the amygdala part of our brain. So it's the reptilian part that's just responsible for survival. So when you are in fear and you're being controlled, mind control / fear mongering, you're living in this space of fear. What happens is that when the amygdala takes over, all critical thinking is out the door. So this cerebral cortex, which is what we are gifted with as humans, right, that allows us to have critical thinking, it's like good as gone. So what you're trying to rationalize with someone who's living in a survival mentality. So what we have to do is get them back into the ability to access their critical thinking again.
Well, and the critical thinking is just out the window. A lot of people, if you hang out on social media for 5 minutes, you see how little critical thinking there is, and that's kind of been another kind of concerning thing. And I don't know how it's seeped into your practice or not, but people seem to have gotten angrier and more moody, and it just seems like something has triggered them in their head. And of course, it's not like health issues weren't there before, right? But when you put people under stress, COVID, the race stuff, even this crazy election that's coming up, people, they break, and we're seeing a lot of people break right now.
So in regards to that, a lot of probably your listeners, my patients, are what we call empaths. So these are people who are able to tap into energy. They're more sensitive. They're more kind of connected to people. And so I will always stop them if they're coming in with anxiety or anger. And I'll say, okay, let's tap in for a second, because you can use this pandemic as a gift to try to tap into your own energy field and ask this one question, which is this emotion even mine? Because so many empaths right now are feeling collective anxiety. They're feeling collective anger, and they're responding to it, and it's not even theirs. So if you can stop for a second and say, am I really angry, or am I just feeling this energy that's out there? Am I really, depressed? And then say, oh, wait, I don't think that really is mine. I think I just got swept up in this. fine. Then sit for a minute, send it light, like send this whole environment light and love, and then go back in and say, what is actually mine? And a lot of times, I know I have had deep feelings of unworthiness, fear, guilt, grief. We've all had emotions pop up because we've had a little more quiet. And when those pop up and I say, if you do find things that are yours, just acknowledge it instead of pushing it back down under alcohol or social media scrolling or whatever avoidance technique you have. Let's try something different, which is sit with it, cry it out a little bit, go dump it into the nature, and you're going to feel better after that. So that's a huge piece to realize and utilize as well.
And that takes such self-awareness though, Lisa. Like people don't allow themselves to get there because sometimes they don't want to be self-aware because they realize they are hurting at some level on the inside, either in their personal life. Like even without COVID and everything else that happened this year, I've got something I'm dealing with this year personally. And I've been able to like say, okay, I know, I realize what's going on. And at a conscious level, okay, it sucks, but I'm dealing with it. And actually, it's kind of been a blessing if you want to look at it. I'm not really worried so much about COVID and some of the other stuff because I got a very real thing that's personal to me in my life.
So I think that most people do, to be honest. And people have been left with their personal things because there's not as much distraction right now. So it's almost like an accelerated purging and accelerated healing in this time period because it's coming up louder and more clearly. And it is human nature to get scared of that. I think especially I'm seeing it a lot in my men, who are told suck it up as a kid, right? Be a man, don't cry. So I'm very attuned to my male patients even more because they are feeling these emotions and have no idea how to process them. So I don't expect them to make a 180 and be suddenly free of it all. I think just having the conversation, letting people know they're allowed to feel a little bit vulnerable, letting people know that they can sit with it, cry with it, journal it, that there are, some groups and healers and places that you can go to get support is really the most important thing. Just hearing about it, not making any change at all can make a difference.
That was the thing that happened to me when I went on sabbatical. Here is September 1st, and I have no social media to check, no podcast to record, no Jimmy rant, no nothing that I was used to. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do now? And all I did was have time to think about life and think about things that I had not been thinking about. And quite frankly, we do push to the side issues mentally that needed to be taken care of. And for me, that meant childhood trauma. I had to come face to face with that. And I'm dealing with that and still kind of working through all that and some other kind of personal things. And so it is amazing that is a blessing out of 2020. People want to just make this a crappy year, but there are some good things that are coming out of this.
Yeah, and I think the childhood stuff, so many people, I have friends, colleagues, patients, we all have had some level of trauma. And I think sitting with it and acknowledging it, some obviously much worse than others, but just allowing it to be and learning how to love yourself in spite of it, which is not easy. So I'm not saying any of this is easy. It has not been easy for me. Right. But what your life looks like on the other side of even just acknowledging it, forget about the deep work, like just acknowledging this happened to me, or, I had this trauma, is going to be enough where your life on the other side, from an energetic standpoint, you're going to start attracting things in your life. You're going to start attracting people in your life. Things are going to start to flow way better than they ever had prior to that. So that's a big part of the gift.
Like getting leukemia at 15, that couldn't have been traumatic to you at all.
Not at all. Yeah. Especially when all of my hair had grown back and was like absolutely gorgeous. And then I got diagnosed again. Yeah. That was pretty rough.
Well, you are a stronger woman today because of that. You've mentioned a few times, and I want to infuse this into the conversation. Again, thank you. This has been beautiful to talk to you about energy and things. Is there a spiritual connection here to our health? And I know the answer. I'm asking rhetorically because I know this is a subject near and dear to your heart.
Absolutely. And I think for me, even at 15, I knew there was a higher purpose. I always felt like I was going to be okay. But as a teenager, I couldn't really describe it. And I honestly didn't know what the purpose was. So what I see, and with my own journey, I would say the past 3 years, especially, or maybe 5 to 10, and I'll just tell you one real quick story because I know we're almost running out of time. But I was at a conference about 4 years ago, and my heart had started acting up a little bit, which it hadn't done in years. And I was with a bunch of healers that I really respected that I didn't know that well. They were people who'd already kind of hit it big on their podcasts and their books and all this stuff. It was about 7 of us, and we found each other because energy related people tend to do that. And we ended up in a bar at midnight having tea. So the waitress didn't like us very much. And we were going around the table talking about our personal stuff and helping each other, which is a beautiful space that energy healers tend to go. So when it got to my turn, I said, my heart's acting up. I don't know why. And one of these little fireballs out of LA, she goes, oh, just hush. Like she hushed me and everybody at the table. And she said, of course your heart's acting up. You don't know what love is. And just let that bomb drop on the table. And I said, well, yeah, I do. I've blah, blah, blah. I've been married. I've been, listing off all these things. And then her colleague from DC teams up with her and they both go, actually, it's way worse than that. You don't love yourself. And they just literally dropped that bomb on the table. So I went up to my room because I had already done a lot of spiritual work in terms of trying to tie in with my patients, like the journeys that they're on, how it can present in physical disease. I had already done a lot of that work on myself, trying to purge old traumas in all different types of ways. I found a blind healer who was restoring my, through Jinshin Jitsu. There's all kinds of cool techniques. I work with crystals. But here it was in my face, you do not know, you don't love yourself. So after crying and meditating, I said, wait, what if she's right? Like, what if they're right? So talk about the spiritual wake up. I do believe the past 3 years, the ability to go from an ejection fraction of 15 with a heart transplant doctor waiting in the room to it now being 50.
Wow.
Other than obviously mitochondrial optimization, ketogenic diet, IV exosomes, I did a lot of work. I did get a pacemaker device in my chest, but I believe most of it has been me finding me again because I was a people-pleasing mess who just went in and cleaned up everybody else's stuff. Mm-hmm. And I found authenticity again. It's a constant journey, as you know, but it's one that probably has the most rewarding aspects on the other side.
Oh, you are hitting me hard right here because
Yeah.
I've been through a similar kind of transformation. I don't know that I call it spiritual, but it's definitely a major shift in my energy as you're describing it, of being grateful for the bad stuff. Like I was abused in my teenage years. I'm now grateful for it because I'm the guy I am now because of that. I also have more of a heart for wanting to help people and being real through that. I've always wanted to help people, but I never knew why. Now I know why.
Awesome.
What I was called to do. It's why I'm so passionate. It's why 15 plus years I've been doing this, and I'm more excited today than I've ever been in my whole life.
Beautiful. Because now you're going to find, just like I have found, the synchronicities that pop up, the flow, the opportunities, the way things just show up.
Finding you was a blessing.
Absolutely.
Reached out to me. I love your work. And I'm like, oh, wow, you're amazing. Let's get you on the podcast.
Absolutely. And I will tell you, like as recently as this morning, because we're taking our COVID questions to the next level. And I had my PhD show up and I don't always wear blue. And he walks in and usually he wears black scrubs and he walked in with these perfect blue scrubs that matched exactly. So I said, how perfect is that? If we had planned that, it wouldn't have worked. And one of my patients is a really well-known news anchor in Tampa. And she had reached out that she's starting a health and wellness show. And she only has a certain time slot, but she wants to showcase so many of the things that we do in the office. And it turned out the time slot was the exact time that he and I were going to do a video. So I said, well, if you want to come by. So she comes in this morning. I go to open the door, the exact same color dress. So this is the kind of fun things that happen when you start to flow in authenticity. And that's just a silly one, but it happens in all aspects of your life when you stay true.
Hey, it might be silly, but it's real.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
definitely a reminder that you're on the right path. Well, Dr. Lisa Koche, there she is, Dr. Lisa Koche over on Instagram. Definitely go give her a ringy dingy. And yeah, you do some Instagram lives there and put them on IGTV for people to be educated and encouraged. And that's what I love about you, Lisa. You don't just teach, you also uplift. We have a lot of teachers that you're at the end of and you kind of don't feel better. You just feel smarter, I guess, but you don't feel better. You both feel smarter and better after you listen to Lisa. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Jimmy. It was a pleasure.